When we think of Prohibition, we think of violent men. We think of Al Capone smashing baseball bats, Lucky Luciano organizing hits, or Machine Gun Kelly terrorizing the Midwest. We picture a world dominated by testosterone, cigar smoke, and brute force. It is the standard Hollywood narrative. The gangster film is almost exclusively a male genre. But what if I told you that while the FBI was obsessed with chasing down these violent thugs, there was a woman operating in the shadows who was arguably smarter, wealthier, and far more elusive than any of them? I would say that sounds like a story that has been conveniently erased from the history books. We are talking about Gertrude Lythgoe. In the 1920s, she wasn't just a participant in the illegal liquor trade, she was a titan. They called her the Queen of the Bootleggers, and for good reason. And the most incredible part? She didn't rely on a Tommy gun. She didn't rely on intimidation or extortion. She used corporate strategy, international law, and a level of logistical genius that left the Bureau of Investigation, the precursor to the FBI, completely baffled. Welcome to the show. Today, we are dissecting the life of the only woman to ever operate a wholesale liquor export house in Nassau during the height of the dry years. A woman who looked federal agents in the eye and told them to go home. This is the story of Gertrude Lythgoe, the woman who outsmarted the United States government. To understand Gertrude, we have to strip away the later mythology of the Bahama Queen and look at where she came from. She wasn't born into crime. She wasn't a mob wife taking over for a fallen husband. She was, quite simply, a working woman in a world that didn't value working women. Exactly. She was born in 1888, the youngest of 10 children. She grew up in California, and by all accounts, she was incredibly sharp. She trained as a stenographer and a secretary. Now, in the early 20th century, that was the ceiling for most women. You took dictation, you typed, and you stayed quiet. But Gertrude had an ambition that couldn't be contained by a typing pool. She eventually moved to New York City. She was working for a company that exported goods, and this is where she cut her teeth on global trade. She learned about shipping manifests, bills of lading, international tariffs. It was the boring, bureaucratic side of business. Boring until 1920. That is when the Volstead Act goes into effect. Overnight, the manufacture and sale of intoxicating liquors becomes illegal in the United States. For most law-abiding citizens, this was a moral crusade. For Gertrude Lythgoe, it was a market inefficiency. That is the perfect way to put it. She saw a demand that wasn't going away and a supply chain that had been broken by the government. She didn't see crime, she saw arbitrage. While male gangsters were fighting over territory in Chicago, Gertrude was looking at a map. She was looking at the Bahamas. Nassau, specifically. It was a British colony. British law did not ban alcohol. It was perfectly legal to import high-end scotch and whiskey into Nassau, and it was perfectly legal to sell it to anyone with a boat. What that person did with the boat after they left the harbor was, legally speaking, not Nassau's problem. So here's this young woman, barely in her 30s, walking into the offices of major British distillers. We are talking about Haig & Haig, DeWars, the big names. She tells them, "I want to be your wholesale distributor in Nassau." Can you imagine the reaction? They must have laughed her out of the room. A woman in the liquor trade? It was unheard of. It was considered a rough, dirty business even before it was illegal. But Gertrude had something they didn't expect. She had cash, she had confidence, and she had a terrifyingly intense stare. She wasn't asking for permission. She was offering them a conduit to the American market that they were desperate to access. She eventually convinced a major London exporter to give her a shot. She packed her bags and moved to Nassau. And when she arrived, it wasn't the vacation paradise we think of today. It was the Wild West of the Atlantic, the Klondike of the tropics, they called it. It was swarming with rum runners, pirates, thieves, and spies. And in the middle of this chaos, Gertrude Lythgoe opens her shop. She sets up an office. She isn't hiding in a basement. She has a legitimate storefront. She hires staff. She starts bringing in thousands of cases of top-shelf liquor. And the male bootleggers, the captains of these rum-running ships, they didn't know what to make of her. They walked in expecting a rough-and-tumble gangster, and they found a woman in high fashion, looking like a movie star holding a ledger. There is a famous story from her early days. A captain tried to shortchange her or intimidate her. Gertrude didn't call for muscle. She simply told him that if he didn't pay the agreed price, he would never load a single crate of quality whiskey in Nassau again. She controlled the supply. If you wanted the good stuff, the stuff that sold for premium prices in New York speakeasies, you had to go through her. She understood leverage. She wasn't just selling booze, she was curating a brand. In a market flooded with dangerous homemade moonshine that could make people go blind, Gertrude Lythgoe guaranteed authenticity. Her word was her bond. That is how she earned the nickname, the Bahama Queen. This brings us to the height of her operation, and where the conflict with the law really escalates. By the mid-1920s, Gertrude is moving millions of dollars worth of inventory. We are talking about a fortune in today's money. She is rubbing elbows with the likes of Bill McCoy, the famous Captain McCoy who gave us the phrase, the real McCoy. McCoy was her favorite captain because he didn't water down the booze. They were kindred spirits in that way, honest criminals. But as her profile rose, so did the attention from the United States government. The FBI and the Prohibition Bureau were furious. They knew exactly where the liquor was coming from. But here is the genius of her setup. She never set foot on the smuggling boats. Her transaction ended at the dock in Nassau. Legally, she was a British merchant selling goods in British territory. The U.S. agents would come to Nassau undercover. They would swarm the hotels, trying to catch her slipping up. She described being watched constantly. She would be eating dinner at a hotel, and she would spot an agent 2 tables over. Instead of running, she would raise her glass to them. It was psychological warfare. She knew they had no jurisdiction there. There was one incident where an agent actually approached her. He tried to trap her into admitting a conspiracy to smuggle. He posed as a buyer asking for help getting the goods past the Coast Guard. Gertrude looked at him and said, "My dear sir, once it leaves my warehouse, I don't care if you drink it, sell it, or pour it in the ocean. I am a wholesaler. Logistics are your problem." It was maddening for them. They had her file thick with reports, but no evidence of a crime committed on U.S. soil. But the game started to change as the U.S. government put pressure on the British. They started expanding the maritime limit, pushing the rum row, that line of ships waiting in international waters, further and further out. The logistics became a nightmare. Ships were getting seized, captains were getting arrested. The violence was escalating too. Hijackers or go-through guys were attacking the rum sherps. Gertrude had to be incredibly careful about who she trusted with her cargo. She had to become a detective herself. She had informants telling her which captains were skimming off the top, or which ones might be working a deal with the feds. She was running a counterintelligence operation from a hotel room in the Caribbean, and she was doing this while battling rampant sexism. There were constant rumors. The press in New York painted her as this exotic, dangerous temptress. They said she carried a dagger in her garter. They said she seduced customs agents. She hated that. She wanted to be respected as a CEO, not fetishized as a gangster moll. It's ironic. The newspapers made her into a character she wasn't, but that character helped her business. The mystery made the liquor more valuable. This came from the Bahama Queen, a speakeasy owner would say, and charged double. But the net was tightening. The U.S. Coast Guard began to blockade the route more effectively. The profits were still there, but the risk was becoming astronomical. In 1925, the U.S. government indicted a massive ring of bootleggers. They threw a wide net, hoping to catch everyone involved in the Nassau trade. And Gertrude's name was on that list. Now, she was in Nassau, so they couldn't just grab her, but if she ever set foot on American soil, she was done. She was effectively exiled. Most people would have stayed in the Caribbean, living off their millions in the sun. But Gertrude didn't do that, and this is the part of the story that really shows her character. She became ill. The stress, the tropical climate, it was wearing her down. She decided she wanted to go home. She wanted to return to the United States even if it meant facing the music. So she does the unthinkable. She travels to New Orleans. She knows the agents are waiting. She is arrested almost immediately. The newspapers went wild. The Queen captured. The FBI finally had their prize. They hauled her into court. The prosecution was ready to make an example of her. They wanted to show that even the Queen couldn't escape the long arm of the law. But then the case started to crumble. Why? Because Gertrude had been meticulous. They had charged her with conspiracy to violate the Volstead Act, but every single piece of paper she had signed, every check she had cashed, was executed in Nassau under British law. She had never physically transported the liquor into the U.S. herself. Her lawyers argued a jurisdictional nightmare for the prosecution. They essentially said, you cannot arrest a woman for doing business legally in a foreign country just because you don't like where her products ended up. It was a bold legal defense. The charges against her in New Orleans were eventually dropped. It was a humiliating defeat for the government. They had spent years hunting her, and when they finally got her into a courtroom, they couldn't make it stick. However, the legal battles took a toll. She was exhausted. She realized the era was ending. The mob was taking over the trade, turning it into a blood sport. The gentlemanly days of Bill McCoy were over. So, Gertrude Lythgoe did the smartest thing a gambler can do. She cashed out. She retired. She moved to Los Angeles, of all places. She lived in the Bunker Hill area. And for a while, she was a minor celebrity. She even wrote a memoir, which was serialized in newspapers. She wanted to tell her side of the story, to correct the record about the dagger in the garter nonsense. But as the 1930s rolled on and Prohibition was repealed, the public lost interest. The Great Depression took over the headlines. Gertrude Lythgoe, the woman who had commanded a fleet of ships and millions of dollars, faded into obscurity. She lived a quiet life, eventually passing away in 1974 at the age of 86. It is staggering to think about. She lived for another 40 years after her empire collapsed, just living a normal life in LA. No prison time, no violent end. She beat the system and walked away. History remembers the ones who made the most noise, the ones who fired the guns. But Gertrude Lythgoe proved that the most dangerous weapon in the room wasn't a pistol, it was a business plan. She was the queen of the bootleggers, and she remains one of the few figures from that era who truly won the game. Thanks for listening. When you think about the Prohibition era, the Roaring '20s, and the illicit liquor trade, the mind immediately jumps to the heavy hitters. You picture Al Capone in Chicago chomping on a cigar. You imagine Dutch Schultz or Lucky Luciano. It is a history written in gunpowder and testosterone. It is a narrative dominated by men in pinstripe suits carrying Tommy guns. Right, it's the classic gangster movie trope. We have been conditioned to believe that the criminal underworld of the 1920s was an exclusive boys' club, where women were just gun malls, dancers, or distressed damsels. But that is a massive oversimplification.
It is entirely wrong, because while the FBI was obsessed with hunting down Capone and his violent cohorts, there was a woman operating out of the Bahamas who was arguably running a smarter, cleaner, and more profitable operation than most of those men combined. Her name was Gertrude Lythgoe, and they called her the Queen of the Bootleggers. The Queen of the Bootleggers. That is quite a title. But I have to admit, until we started digging into this, I hadn't heard much about her. Why is she such a ghost in the history books? That is the million-dollar question, and we are going to get to that. But first, we have to understand who she was. Gertrude wasn't born into crime. She wasn't a street tough. She was born in 1888, the daughter of a British diplomat. She was educated, she was refined, and started her career as a stenographer. A stenographer? That is a long way from being a criminal mastermind. How does someone go from taking dictation to running a multi-million-dollar liquor empire? Ambition and timing. Before the 18th Amendment dropped the hammer on alcohol sales in the United States, Gertrude was working for a legitimate liquor exporter in New York City. She wasn't just typing letters, she was watching. She was learning the trade, the logistics of shipping, the chemistry of spirits, the art of the deal. She had a mind for business that her male bosses often underestimated. So when Prohibition hits in 1920, most people in the legitimate liquor trade are panicking. They are closing up shop or selling off their inventory for pennies on the dollar. But I'm guessing Gertrude saw something else. Exactly. She saw the market shift. She realized that the demand wasn't going away, it was just moving underground. And because it was illegal, the profit margins were about to skyrocket. While her male colleagues were wringing their hands, Gertrude packed her bags. She went straight to the source. She traveled to London to meet with the biggest distillers in the world, specifically the Haig & Haig Whiskey Company. Hold on. A young American woman in 1920 walks into a boardroom of stuffy British whiskey lords and tries to cut a deal? That must have been a sight. It was unprecedented. You have to picture this. Gertrude was striking. She was described as looking like a college student or a high society flapper. She was slim, fashionable, and had this disarming, innocent look. But when she opened her mouth, she was pure steel. She told the British distillers that Prohibition in America was going to be a gold rush, and she was the only one with the know-how to get their product into the hands of the buyers. And they believed her? Eventually, yes. She secured a wholesale contract. She wasn't going to be a rum runner herself. She wasn't going to drive the boats. She was going to be the wholesaler. She set up shop in Nassau, in the Bahamas. Nassau, the pirate capital of the 1700s, turning into the bootleg capital of the 1920s. Precisely. Nassau was a British territory, so alcohol was perfectly legal there. It became the staging ground. Ships would come from Europe loaded with scotch, whiskey, and gin, and they would dock in Nassau. Then the American rum runners would take their smaller, faster boats, load up at the Nassau docks, and make the sprint to the Florida coast or up to Rum Row off New York. So Gertrude positions herself as the gatekeeper. If you wanted the good stuff, the real Hague and Hague, you had to go through her. That's right. She set up her office at the Hotel Lucerne in Nassau, and this is where the legend of the Bahama Queen really begins. You have to understand the environment. Nassau was the Wild West. It was swarming with cutthroats, thieves, desperate captains, and spies. A woman alone in that environment was considered easy prey. I can imagine the sharks circling. They must have thought they could intimidate her or just steal her inventory.
They tried. But Gertrude had a policy. She never carried a gun, but she had a gaze that could freeze water. There's a famous story where a group of tough captains tried to muscle in on her pricing. She invited them into her office, sat behind her desk, and calmly explained the economics of supply and demand until they backed down. She told a reporter once, "I am not afraid of any man," and she meant it. She commanded respect not through violence, but through competence. She was the smartest person in the room. That is fascinating because it contrasts so sharply with the violence happening in Chicago or New York. She was running a clean business in a dirty industry. It was clean in terms of violence, but it was massive in scale. She was moving thousands of cases a month. We are talking about millions of dollars in modern currency flowing through her hands. And because she dealt in high-quality, authentic liquor, not the dangerous moonshine that was blinding people back in the States, her reputation soared. The rum runners knew that if they bought from Lythgoe, they could charge a premium. So she's in Nassau making a fortune. Where does the FBI come into this? Because technically, if she's in the Bahamas, she's outside their jurisdiction, right? Technically, yes, and that was her genius. She wasn't breaking Bahamian law. She was a legal exporter. The people breaking the law were the ones buying from her and taking it to America. But the US government was furious. The State Department and the Bureau of Investigation, the precursor to the modern FBI, knew exactly who she was. They had files on her. They called her a menace. It must have driven them crazy. A woman sitting on a tropical island, thumbing her nose at the entire US federal government. It drove them absolutely mad. They sent agents to Nassau to spy on her. They tried to get the British government to deport her, but she had her paperwork in perfect order. She paid her taxes in Nassau. She contributed to the local economy. The Bahamian officials loved her. She was untouchable. But the US agents didn't give up. How did the cat and mouse game evolve? Well, they started targeting her supply chain. If they couldn't touch her, they would touch the boats leaving her docks. The Coast Guard ramped up patrols, but Gertrude was always one step ahead. She had an incredible network of informants. She knew when the cutters were patrolling and where. She would advise her captains on safe routes. She wasn't just a seller, she was a logistical consultant for the smugglers. She was practically running air traffic control for bootleggers, essentially, and she had strict standards. She refused to do business with captains who were known to be reckless or who mixed her good whiskey with rubbing alcohol to stretch profits. She cared about the brand. This is what separated her from the gangsters. She treated bootlegging like a legitimate corporate enterprise. Did she ever have run-ins with the other big names? We hear about Bill McCoy, the real McCoy. Did their paths cross? Oh, absolutely. Bill McCoy was one of her best customers. They had a mutual respect. McCoy was known for never watering down his booze, and Lythgoe is known for never selling fake product. They were the gold standard. In a world of criminals, they were the honest ones. McCoy actually wrote about her in his memoirs. He described her as having a brain like a steel trap. So she's winning. She's rich, she's respected, and she's out of reach of the FBI. What changed? The geopolitical landscape shifted. The United States put immense pressure on Great Britain. They basically said, look, your colony in the Bahamas is undermining our constitution. You need to do something. The British government, not wanting a diplomatic crisis, started to tighten the screws on Nassau. They began cracking down on the exporters. So the sanctuary was crumbling. Slowly, yes. But Gertrude didn't panic. She saw the writing on the wall again, just like she did in 1920. She realized the golden age of Nassau was ending. But instead of quitting, she decided to make one last massive play. She wanted to move a huge shipment directly into the States, bypassing the small-time runners. That sounds risky. That means leaving the safety of the island.
It was incredibly risky, and this is where the story takes a turn toward the dramatic. She actually traveled to New Orleans. She was personally overseeing the distribution of a massive shipment, 1,000 cases of top-shelf liquor. The FBI had been waiting for a mistake like this for years.
They caught wind of her presence. This was their chance. They finally had the queen on American soil. They arrested her in New Orleans. It was a huge headline, Queen of the Bootleggers captured. The press went wild. They expected to see a hardened criminal. Instead, out walks this elegant, fashionable woman who looks like she's on her way to a tea party. She charmed the socks off the reporters. How did the trial go? I imagine the prosecutors were ready to throw the book at her. They were. But Gertrude had money, and she had the best lawyers. More importantly, she knew the law better than they did. The case against her was complicated because, technically, most of her actions had taken place outside U.S. jurisdiction. The prosecution struggled to pin a specific act of smuggling directly on her. She maintained she was a legitimate businesswoman who sold a product in a place where it was legal. What happened to it after was not her responsibility. The classic, I just sell the hammer, I don't tell you to break the window defense. It worked to an extent. The charges didn't stick in the way the FBI hoped. She wasn't sent to Alcatraz. She wasn't locked away for decades. She managed to navigate the legal system with the same dexterity she used in the business world. But the arrest and the legal battle took a toll. She realized the game was truly over. The feds were never going to stop watching her now. So she retired? That's rare in organized crime. Usually you leave in a coffin or handcuffs. That is the most remarkable part of Gertrude Lythgoe's story. She knew when to fold them. In the late 1920s, she packed up her earnings, which were substantial, and moved to Los Angeles. She completely reinvented herself. She lived at the Biltmore Hotel. She became a legitimate resident. She just walked away with the money. She walked away. While Capone went to prison for tax evasion and other gangsters were getting gunned down in the streets, Gertrude Lythgoe was living a quiet, comfortable life in California. She eventually wrote a memoir, which is one of the few records we have of her voice. It was called The Bahama Queen. But even then, she was careful. She didn't incriminate her partners. That loyalty probably kept her alive, too. No loose ends. Exactly. She died in 1974, at the age of 86. She lived a long, full life. She outlived the Prohibition era, she outlived her rivals, and she outlived the agents who hunted her. So why is she forgotten? If she was this successful, this powerful, why isn't there a movie about her? Why isn't she a household name? It comes down to the narrative we discussed at the beginning. History prefers simple archetypes. The violent male gangster is a story that sells. It fits the mold. A brilliant female logistics expert who operates non-violently and successfully retires, that disrupts the narrative. It doesn't fit the crime doesn't pay moral that the FBI and Hollywood wanted to push for decades. Because for her, crime did pay. It paid very well. And that is an uncomfortable truth for history books. Also, because she was a woman, the press at the time often treated her as a novelty. They focused on her looks, her clothes, her feminine wiles, rather than her business acumen. They trivialized her. It's a classic case of erasing female agency. They couldn't admit she outsmarted them, so they had to make it seem like she was just a pretty face who got lucky. Precisely. But when you look at the documents, the shipping manifests, and the FBI files, the truth is undeniable. She wasn't a mascot. She was the boss. She managed a complex international supply chain under extreme pressure. She negotiated with multinational corporations. She handled millions of dollars in cash. She was a CEO in an era when women were barely allowed to be secretaries. It puts a whole new spin on the Roaring Twenties. It wasn't just Gatsby and Capone. It was Gertrude Lythgoe, sitting in the Hotel Lucerne, moving chess pieces across the Atlantic.
And winning. That's the key. She won the game. And that is why her story deserves to be told. It's a story of empowerment, intellect, and survival against the odds. She was the one who got away. I think we need to talk a bit more about the specifics of her operation, because the mechanics of it are fascinating. You mentioned the supercargo system earlier. Can we dig into that? Because that seems like one of her innovations that kept her safe. Absolutely. This was one of her brilliant safeguards. A supercargo is essentially a representative of the owner on board a ship. Gertrude realized that once the liquor left her dock, she lost control. Captains could steal it, sell it on the side, or claim it was seized when it wasn't. So she started placing her own trusted men, supercargos, on the boats. These men weren't sailors, they were accountants with guns. Accountants with guns. I love that image. Their job was to ensure that the transaction at sea on Rum Row went exactly as planned. They handled the money. When a smaller boat came out from New York or New Jersey to buy cases from the mothership, the supercargo would verify the cash.
No credit, no IOUs, cash on the barrelhead. This minimized her risk of theft and ensured that the money coming back to Nassau was accurate to the penny. It's corporate oversight. She brought corporate structure to piracy, and it drove her competitors crazy because they were losing money to skimming and theft left and right. Gertrude's margins were tighter because she had better controls. This allowed her to pay her suppliers in London on time every time, which solidified her reputation with the British. While other bootleggers were defaulting on debts or getting killed over disputes, Gertrude was sending wire transfers. You know, there's another aspect of this I want to touch on: the sheer physical toll. Living in Nassau in the 1920s wasn't like a vacation at the Atlantis resort today. No AC, tropical diseases, constant heat. It was grueling. And Gertrude was known for her work ethic. She would be down at the docks at 4 a.m., overseeing the loading. She checked the crates herself. She was battling the heat, the mosquitoes, and the constant stress. She actually lost a significant amount of weight during her years there. She looked frail by the end of it. It wasn't a glamorous life of parties. It was hard, grinding labor. She sacrificed her health for the empire. That makes the retirement even more sensible. She burned the candle at both ends and got out before it burned her. There is a funny anecdote about her health. She was so thin that people started rumors she was a drug addict. But she wasn't. She didn't even drink that much. She was just exhausted. When she finally moved to Los Angeles, she spent the first few months just sleeping and eating, trying to recover from the stress of being the most wanted woman in the Caribbean. Let's go back to the FBI for a second. We talked about how they couldn't catch her in Nassau, but surely they tried to set traps. Did they ever try to plant undercover agents in her organization? They tried. There were several instances where buyers would show up, claiming to represent big syndicates in Chicago or Detroit. They would flash big rolls of cash and try to get her to agree to smuggle the goods onto American soil herself. That was the trap: conspiracy to violate the Volstead Act within U.S. jurisdiction. Entrapment. Classic entrapment. But Gertrude had a sixth sense for it. She would look these men in the eye and say, "I sell liquor in Nassau, FOB, free on board. Once it crosses the rail of your ship, it is your property and your problem. Where you take it is none of my business." She never took the bait. She never verbally agreed to a crime on U.S. soil. She stuck to the script. She was legally bulletproof. That must have been infuriating for J. Edgar Hoover's boys. Hoover was just rising to power during this time, and the Bureau was trying to professionalize. Someone like Gertrude was an embarrassment. She made them look incompetent. That's why when they finally arrested her in New Orleans, they wanted a show trial. They needed a win.
But even then, the public was kind of on her side, weren't they? By the late 20s, people were getting tired of Prohibition. The tide had turned. People were sick of the violence, the corruption, and the hypocrisy. When they saw this woman who provided high-quality spirits and didn't kill anyone, standing up against the federal government, she became a bit of a folk hero. The jury wasn't exactly eager to convict her. It's hard to find 12 people who didn't enjoy a drink themselves. So, looking back at her legacy, if we were to rewrite the history books today, where does she fit in? Is she a villain, a pioneer, a capitalist? She's a disruptor. I think she fits into the history of American business as much as the history of crime. She identified a market inefficiency created by government regulation, Prohibition, and she exploited it with ruthless efficiency. If she had been born 50 years later, she probably would have been a CEO of a logistics company or a tech startup. She had that kind of brain. It really challenges the stereotype of the mall. The mall is passive. The mall is an accessory. Gertrude was the engine. Exactly. And let's not forget the danger she faced from her own side. We talked about the FBI, but we glossed over the hijackers, the go-through guys. These were pirates who would board rum-running boats, kill the crew, and steal the cargo. Gertrude had to negotiate with these people too. Sometimes she had to pay protection money, sometimes she had to bluff. There were times when her shipments were hit and she lost thousands of dollars, but she never let them see her sweat. She absorbed the losses and kept moving. Resilience, that's the word that keeps coming to mind. Resilience and adaptability. When the Coast Guard got faster boats, she found faster captains. When the radio codes were broken, she invented new ciphers. She was constantly evolving. That is why she lasted for years when most bootleggers lasted months. It's a shame her memoir is out of print. It sounds like a manual for survival. It is hard to find, but the excerpts we have are telling. She writes with a very distinct voice, wry, observant, and unapologetic. She doesn't ask for forgiveness. She basically says, "I saw an opportunity, I took it, and I did it better than the men." And frankly, she's right.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the life of Gertrude Lythgoe, what is the one thing you want our listeners to take away? What is the lesson here? The lesson is to look beyond the headlines. History is often written by the loudest voices, and in the 1920s, the loudest voices were the Tommy guns in Chicago. But real power often operates in the shadows, quietly, efficiently, and intelligently. Gertrude Lythgoe proved that you don't need to be the strongest or the most violent to win. You just need to be the smartest. She outsmarted the FBI, she outlasted the gangsters, and she walked away free. In the game of Prohibition, she was the Grandmaster, the Queen of the Bootleggers, a title she definitely earned. Thanks for bringing this story to light. It's a reminder that there are so many hidden figures in history just waiting to be rediscovered. Absolutely. And next time you see a movie about the Roaring Twenties, just remember, while the boys were playing cops and robbers, Gertrude was running the business.